Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. I'm Suzanne Sherman, and I will be your host here for the next hour on the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Today is Tuesday, August 6th. Jeff Johnson is manning the control panel here in the virtual studio here, and I am coming at you live from the hinterlands of Utah. You can follow us on Facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network. CRN is our fan page. And we've got Alan Mendenhall joining us. Alan, why don't you shut your camera off? That'll give some bandwidth for Jeff here for us. And I'll be introducing our guest momentarily, but I'm a huge fan of his, and we have been meaning to get him on the air for some time. And let's see, we don't have a live YouTube feed right now. We have lost that ability to do so, but we are broadcasting live via Radio Co. And we have a low bandwidth option for it. We have both of those pinned as posts on our network page. Suzanne C. Sherman is my website, SuzanneCSherman.com. You can go to the social media bar and get our SoundCloud links there, as well as my published articles and latest blogs, one of which shares my experiences in the Santa Clara County under Sheriff Lori Smith trying to get a concealed carry permit. And that, as you may recall, the scene of the shooting at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. I want to thank Missouri Liberty Radio for syndicating my show. So big howdy to our friends in Owensville, Missouri. And a thank you for their intro song, the band Roxanne album Radio Silence, Rat Pack Records. I have the album. The whole thing is outstanding. So thank you very much. Want to remind you, if you listen to our Radio link, you can just go there 24/7. Jeff Johnson, producer, manager of the network, has done a fantastic job making sure there is always some solid content for you to listen to. Waking Up Cerberus, a watch us reports. Jeff, do you hear that noise on the line? I'm getting some feedback here. If you don't worry about it. Spy Who Loves Liberty, Greg Carpenter's show, also Liberty Minutes, Case in Point, Fundamentals of Federalism. Mike Meharry has some blogs. The Alan Mosley's The Gold Standard. We have those are going to be coming up. My show will be syndicated on his network as well. Introducing also the Robert Scott Bell Show, and that airs every afternoon. I think Saturday. Monday through Saturday, 1 to 3, I believe, and some really good stuff there. Tip of the Spear with Justin Spears, new podcast also in rotation. Did I get everything, Jeff?
I believe so. At least I hope so.
All right. Well, we do a lot of talk here about the problem, as we've seen right now with the gun shootings that we have had and these massacres. The Democrats haven't wasted any time in marching forward with gun control. And guess what? The feds haven't either. The Republicans haven't either. And here's the issue. This is not a national solution. This is a community problem to be addressed through the states and local communities. We have an issue with Donald Trump now saying white nationalism, white supremacy is a problem. And I've been saying all along, and we say it here all the time, is the United States is plural. It is not a nation. And joining me to elaborate on that is attorney Alan Mendenhall. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much for having me.
Well, I met Alan for the first time, for those of you that don't know, at the Abbeville Institute Symposium on Secession and Nullification. And that took place in Dallas in November of last year. And I'll tell you, Alan, when you were up there speaking, I was sitting there with Mark Kreslins at the back, and I said, oh my goodness, who is this guy? You did an outstanding job. Jeff Deist also spoke from Mises, and Michael Bolden from the 10th Amendment Center. as well as Marcus Ruiz Evans from Yes California, part of the Cal Exit movement. Now, Alan, you just recently had an article come out. Let's have you talk about it. Give an intro first about who you are and how people can find you, and then let's talk about the problem with national conservatism.
Well, sure. Yeah, my name is Alan Mendenhall. I am an associate dean at Faulkner University, Thomas Good Jones School of Law, Montgomery, Alabama, and executive director of the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty. I have a website, which is alanmendenhall.com, and that's ALLENMendenhall.com. And I guess we're here to talk about why the United States is not a nation.
Yes, and I say this all the time, but it's really nice to have my listeners hear from somebody else so they don't think I'm just some crazy woman in the mountains. This stuff on my own. Minds greater than, much smarter than my own are saying the same thing. Don Livingston also spoke at that event, by the way, and you can find his book, Rethinking the American Union in the 21st Century. I'm going to have an Amazon affiliate link on my website. If you want to order through there, that really does help us out. And there is a donate button also if you are so inclined. Let's get into your article, Alan.
Okay, well, we use the word nation casually all the time, but we actually are misusing the word. Can you hear me, Susan?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes, I can. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would define a nation as a community of people, not a state, not a government, but a community of people bound together by shared culture, language, territory, history, customs, traditions, mores, values. And yes, it is true that they do mobilize politically insofar as they have their own goals and ambitions as a common people and seek to attain whatever ends is beneficial to that people, but they're not political in character in the way that, say, a government might be. So nationalism is different from a country. Natio is a word for birth. It's into origin. It's the Latin word. So I think it might help to list examples of nations so that people can say, oh yeah, the United States isn't that. I mean, a lot of the Indian nations, so Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, those are nations. There were Celtic nations. Ireland and Scotland took on the character of nations when they were opposed to the British Empire. Anglo-Saxon England, when it was warding off the Norman invaders. I mean, the closest thing to a nation where a country and a nation might, a nation and a nation and a country might overlap today would be like Japan. Because when you talk about the Japanese people, you really are talking about a people that do have a common culture, language, territory, history, common customs, common traditions, mores, values. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about nations. And of course, the multiplicities within multiplicities within multiplicities, the sheer diversity and variety of American experience makes it impossible for the United States of America to be a nation. It never was a nation. The earliest commentators on the United States of America treated the states themselves as sovereign, and there was the compact theory of the Union, where the states were joined by confederation, but they were independent and sovereign nations. And so we've sort of lost this sense of what a nation is, and therefore, when we use the term casually, nation, we're actually misusing the term.
And what's interesting there is when we talk about national government, federal government, the two were diametrically opposed propositions when the Constitution was being debated. In fact, the national government, which was proposed in the Virginia Plan, never even made it to the ratification debates themselves. It was shut down in Philadelphia. So the differences, which was proposed, the Virginia Plan by James Madison and Edmund Randolph, beg your pardon, was again based on the premise that the new government that would be created, and I believe that this was a coup over the Articles of Confederation. The delegates didn't have the authority to come up with this new system of government, but the government that was rejected was the strong national government, which it would even have a negative or a veto over state laws vis-a-vis the new legislature. And what we're seeing now is a de facto veto via the judiciary branch. So again, even how the government was described from the beginning, with the Federalists taking up the nationalist position and the anti-Federalists having to be kind of on the defensive because just the very nature of their description was somewhat negative. So let's see why this happens. We had the Articles of Confederation, where we had sovereign and independent states coming together for limited purposes. And I think one of the biggest myths we have right now, that when the Constitution was ratified, the states surrendered their sovereignty to become a part of a greater whole. Why don't you address that?
Well, I mean, I think that even after the Constitution, states still had a sense that they were independent and sovereign. And really, I would say the two defining moments in the history of the United States that changed that perception were the Civil War, obviously, biggest one, or the war between the states, whatever you want to call it. And then World War II. I do think that Americans tended to unite together against a common enemy in World War II and began to think of themselves as, quote unquote, one nation under God, which is a phrase that would not have been used earlier in Americans' history, not because of the controversy behind under God, but because of the controversy behind the word nation. They wouldn't have been using that kind of terminology. So I think those are the two moments that that changed perceptions of the United States. But even still, calling the United States a nation today, I think if people were clear on the terminology, would say, oh, yeah, well, if that's how you're defining nation, then the United States definitely isn't that. It might be carved into several nations, and those nations might not fall along the same boundaries as states, but clearly the United States of America isn't a nation under those terms. What do people and what do Native Hawaiians have in common with the ordinary people in Vermont, or what do people in Alabama, where I live, have in common with people in Alaska, or wherever. I mean, there clearly there are certain cultural values that we might share, but there are just differences, and it makes sense for local communities to have more control over their own populace because they know what's best for their own communities. They have a felt understanding of the needs and wants and desires of their community, and also an ability to address those in a way that some external coercive power cannot.
And just to expound upon what you said about the Pledge of Allegiance and the use of the term nation, I submit to you that the founders would have found repugnant the term indivisible added to.
Exactly. You're exactly right.
Familiar with our friend James Rutledge Rush's article that was published by the Abbeville Institute, Bellamy's Pledge, and he opens up by saying, had George Washington heard the Pledge of Allegiance, he would not have put his hand on his heart. He would have drawn his sword. If you go back to the ratification conventions, you can look at the Virginia ratification debates also. They reserved the right to leave the Union. They did not trust this new government that was created, so that before signing on, they said, okay, fair enough, but look, if it doesn't work out, we have a right to rescind. And if you go back to contract law, you being a lawyer are going to understand this. What is the remedy for one party when one party is in material breach of a contract and perhaps damages can't be calculated? Rescission. You can leave the contract, correct?
That's absolutely correct. And that is the gist of the compact theory of the Union, is that each state is contractually bound to the other. And when the breaching party, when there's a breach, then there's a breach of contract, and you have to seek remedies for that. And all of contract law is aimed at restoring the wronged party, either putting them in a position they would have been in had the contract never occurred, or putting them in the position they would have been in had the breach never occurred. But if something like that can't happen, I mean, courts are loath to to enforce specific, to require specific performance. So what you would typically lead to is, you would rescind the contract, and also, in addition to rescinding it, put the parties back in the position they would have been in had they never reached the contract. Which, when you're talking about a compact theory of the states, is a little bit different. So, I mean, I think it just requires independence. And so, yeah, I mean, the other thing is, when you talked about George Washington, when we look at the Constitutional Convention, we have to remember that it wasn't called for the purpose of creating a constitution. The delegates would never even shown up, many of them, if they knew that that's what they were coming to do. They thought they were coming to revise the Articles of Confederation, or to debate them, or to deliberate about some language in there. They didn't know they were going to be revising the Constitution. That's just something that happened during the Philadelphia Convention. And so, yeah, I agree with you that there was some manipulation there to get people to show up, and then basically discard the Articles of Confederation.
Well, and Patrick Henry, he said he smelled a rat. He didn't even bother showing up. Once John Lansing and Robert Yates from, I believe, Rhode Island or New York,
New York. They were New York.
Well, yeah, Rhode Island, they didn't show up. That's where my confusion was. Once they went back to George Clinton and said, no, this is somebody's pulling the wool over our eyes. And you also have to ask, why did they close the doors, shut the windows, and demand secrecy? So, I always say this was a coup. And for those that believe that this was divinely inspired, I submit to you, ask yourselves very carefully, do you think God works in a way where he has to use deception to come by his purposes?
Well, I do. The one thing is, I do encourage people always to read the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers, and to compare them and to learn them, because I think you gain such clarity on the different visions of government and the different debates that were happening at that era. And that will show you that however bad the Federalist side may have been, however bad the centralizers may have been, we are way, way worse today. I mean, because the freedoms and liberties they were arguing over today are not, some of them, they're just not even on the table anymore. A lot of people just automatically presume that the government has roles in every scope and sphere of human life. So that's one particular reason why I encourage people to go back and read from that period, is just to show how far we've come, that we would, not even recognize the sort of parameters or the paradigms that the founding generation was working with.
Yeah, even Hamilton, I think, would be gobsmacked if he saw what was going on today. And you can get the Anti-Federalist papers. You can get it on a paperback in Amazon. It only costs a few bucks, and it's very, very enlightening. You start your article out by saying, what is national conservatism all about, and why is this a problem? And as you explain, you say it's a result of a marriage of nationalism and conservatism. Let's have you expound upon that.
Well, sure. Well, so the occasion for the piece was this conservative nationalism conference that took place in D.C. in mid-July, and it had a lot of leading luminaries in it. People like Rusty Reno from First Things magazine. John Bolton was a participant, which should always ring alarm bells. Tucker Carlson was a member of it, but Yoram Hazony was really the mastermind behind it. And I'll just say, I actually like Yoram Hazony. I like him as a person. I've met him, and the type of nationalism that he talks about in the historic sense, to me, is not necessarily a bad thing. However, when you try to take the United States and graft that conception of nationalism onto it, A, you're just being inaccurate. You just, because they don't fit together. But B, you're being dangerous because you're trying to instill pride in these central governing authorities. And a lot of the conservative nationalists are advocating the taking over of government. Like they don't want to take over government so that they can dismantle it or whatever. They want to take over the apparatus of government so that they can use it as a weapon. And that's why it's always dangerous for the left or the right to advocate for the increase of central government powers, especially at the federal level in the United States, because once you empower that apparatus, it can be used against you if somebody else takes control over it. Now, recognizing that, the national conservatives, they want to take it over so that they can destroy their enemies with the state, because they realize that if their enemies take over it, then their enemies will destroy them. And this is a zero-sum game. This is why it is so dangerous to empower government in that way.
You know, this is exactly the point that Carl Jones and I were making with regards to national reciprocity. Because when this was being discussed and candidate Trump was saying he supported this, I decided, a lot of people are really under the fallacious misinterpretation of the Second Amendment. That means because our rights will not be infringed, that means that Congress has the constitutional authority to disregard the state's purview to regulate concealed carry permits. So really what we have to understand is, again, because the Second Amendment prohibits absolutely the general government from regulating good or bad with regards to firearms. If you support this, you are granting them this power. Now we've seen 3 shootings within a week. Before we even had these shootings, Kamala Harris was saying she would give Congress 100 days to come up with gun control to her liking, or she would do it via executive order. Let's, for the purpose of argument, say national reciprocity has passed. I can impose Utah's will on California and take my sidearm to California if I were to have a permit. And now Kamala's in office. I heretofore rescind all concealed carry permits whatsoever. Now, if you carry even in your home state, guess what? Executive order. And guess what? We gave them that power because we didn't see the big picture. And Carl and I have tried with some people to explain this. I don't care, I want it anyway. Well, you'll be really happy until they decide to criminalize you. As you said, you mentioned the weaponization of government against people. We saw that with the IRS and Lerner targeting nonprofits that were conservative in nature, delaying their approval. This happened with Compact of the States, which was a proposal for a constitutional amendment putting forth a balanced budget. Kevin Gutzman was on the board of that. They experienced the discriminatory practices and weaponization of the IRS against them. So this is the problem when every single issue becomes a point of national contention with a disregard for, as you mentioned, community standards. We have the Supreme Court weighing in on what is pornographic. We have the Supreme Court weighing in on police procedures the police can practice within each jurisdiction. I wrote about that on the warrantless blood draws of DUI suspects. Justice Thomas said, I don't even care if the suspect is conscious. We have the right, if you're driving on the roads, the police can do this. Now, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Ginsburg had said, no, a warrant is required. So this is what happens when you roll the dice with the Supreme Court, seeking more rights, expect less of them. What do you think? Or fewer of them, I should say.
Well, I completely agree with you. And a few things that you said in there. So the first thing is, the stakes become entirely too high when you have the federal government being empowered to, so that certain groups can try to impose or coerce other areas of the country. So like you said, Utah, what if Utah tried to impose its values on some part of California, or, some part of California tried to impose its values on Rhode Island or wherever? That the federal government was not intended to be something that had that kind of massive control, and over time it's just amassed way too much power. But the other thing is, when we're talking about Constitution, we're talking about the Second Amendment, we're talking about all these different things, it's always important to remember that, yes, this is a document that is just words on paper. Justice Scalia used to talk about the Soviet Constitution and said, well, look, on paper, that document enshrines rights and liberties and is far more protective of them than the United States Constitution. The difference is, in the United States, there's still a culture that values these rights and liberties. And I think that we are now losing that culture here, and that maybe the document does become just words on a page if the people aren't willing to fight for their rights, or not willing to learn about where their liberties come from and why it's important to ensure First and Second Amendment protections, are all the Bill of Rights, frankly, minus the Ninth and Tenth have their own character and do their own thing. But yeah, I mean, people, if the culture does not value these things, then the Constitution will not matter, and that goes at the state level to all 50 state constitutions. If the people do not understand their rights, if they don't have their values and they don't have their an understanding of their customs and their traditions, then they will lose whatever it is that made that constitution or those rules effective in that populace.
Coming full circle to where we started with regards to the unique differences among the cultures of the different states. That was at one time highly respected, and that's why the states wanted to retain their sovereignty. What we're seeing now is a shaming on the very differences that made this experiment possible in the first place. So once upon a time, when the unique differences of the different cultures were respected, now they are disparaged, and we are seeing, again, a disregard for the uniqueness. Again, we have Article 7, which shows that the Constitution was ratified by the different states. We saw the treaty that was signed with King George with the different states. It was never one united state of America. Do you think we can ever overcome now the indoctrination of false history into the minds of those that are going to just see this as one nation and everything has to be solved and mandated from a top-down level from Washington, D.C., because I think that is the reason we are having the very hatred that Donald Trump is saying there's no place for in America. We cannot be one people. We cannot come together as one.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I do think we're able to overcome it, but it may be a long way away. I think it's always important to take the long view, and if you look at the United States of America and you just imagine that you're sitting somewhere 500 years from now, I mean, it would be unreasonable to think that the borders of the country will be identical to what they are today. I mean, territories take different shapes. Borders are arbitrary and fluid. They will change as the culture changes, as their demographic changes. If you look at how many times Europe has been carved up in the last 200 years, it's amazing. So it would be silly, frankly, to say, oh, the United States of America, as it is currently consists today with the 50 states, is going to exist for the next 500 years. I mean, I think everybody recognizes that would be a foolish proposition. So I think what we have to do is get people to start thinking big picture and say, okay, well, if that's the case, if we know that it's not not going to remain in the same shape and form, then how ought we to consider strategically reformulating the boundaries in a way that we could have peaceful transition? Because what we don't want is a separatist movement that turns violent. We don't want violence. Violence is not good for anybody. So how can we make peaceful transitions? How can we facilitate harmony and cooperation? And it might be to pursue these issues of self-determination and to let California split up into multiple Californias, or to let Texas be independent and sovereign, or whatever it is. But I think that's an inevitability, and it's just a matter of embracing the fact that it's an inevitability, and then having reasonable people speak in good faith about how to approach that inevitability so that we don't succumb to violence, so that we don't have the problems we see on TV with all these school shootings and all these different things. Is there another way where we can be more civilized and more peaceful?
And the thing is, if people can entertain the notion that secession is not treason, when you try to raise that discussion with somebody for the first time, you either hear, well, that is treason, or Lincoln settled that. This is an opportunity to release the pressure. It's a pressure valve. Right now, we are really, again, fighting. Everything is national contention, every single issue, gun control, abortion, things were always marriage, left for the states to determine based on their unique communities and cultures. We are fighting over everything. And I see people have to start understanding the myth of what Lincoln did. This was not good for the Union. He did not save the Union. What made the Union special was the fact that it could be divisible. We could have people representing their own interests. People in Ohio don't want people from California or Los Angeles particularly telling them what to do. I know that we only have you here for a half an hour. Again, remind people how they can follow you. And I'd like to get your video. I know it was recorded from the event. Maybe we can get the audio for that up on our website so people can listen.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd be happy to send you that. Yeah, my website is alanmendenhall.com. That's ALLENMENDENHALL.com. And my Twitter handle is @AlanMendenhall, spelled the same way, so that's pretty easy. And basically, if you go to my website, you can find the links to my writings, my books, and my social media. So that's probably the best way to find my stuff.
Yeah, you don't promote your books enough. I didn't know you had any, so shame on you for that one. We'll have to do that. I also suggest you do post a lot of stuff publicly on Facebook. Just so you know, I have you as C First. You always have really insightful stuff, and I appreciate all you do. So, ladies and gentlemen, Alan Mendenhall, I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.